Hello, this is Low Gelder, and this is another installment of Let's Talk Consciousness. Um, I thought I would take a turn for the, strange or esoteric, um, since a lot of these videos have been about maintaining a point of view of unconditional love, forgiveness for yourself, for others, as a way of improving your quality of consciousness and improving your experience in this world. But there's another side of that that I think that's interesting. That is a little bit more esoteric, but it's in theory it's something that you can experiment with yourself. So if it sounds strange or you're skeptical, you can set about doing the things that I do and see what you run into. Um, but It's funny because I'll just backtrack a second to say, through a good chunk of my life, from I would say like age, really starting at like 12, 13, but really officially at about 19, being like to myself and others an atheist. And then by about age 25, 26, getting interested in more, I don't know, existential questions that acknowledge a bit more of a mystery that we all find ourselves in, and being a bit more open-minded about what that mystery may imply. I try to hold on loosely. I don't really think beliefs in general are helpful or good. I think it's helpful to actually really think at any given moment that you could be wrong and take on a different point of view, but also not to be afraid of feeling foolish for entertaining points of views that may seem really strange or absurd. I think there's actually a lot of fun in that. I know people who are more skeptically minded would look at that with a little bit of disgust because it seems intellectually lazy or dishonest or, I don't know, fanciful. But I mean, as I go on, what I mean by that will become more clear. But just in terms of like existential questions, I got to a point where I guess a kind of strictly materialistic point of view got kind of boring, and through life experiences that pointed me in a direction of just looking at things differently and being exposed to new ideas, just growing basically, in brief, growing led me to be a little bit more, again, loose with what reality is. So anyway, getting to my original point, I think it's interesting to set your intention to ask a question essentially to the universe. I mean, to whatever could be listening to your silent thoughts. I mean, so my point is not anything really material, but if again, as a used as a frame of reference, if this experience is a conscious experience, and either we generate it from our consciousness or we are somehow individualized from a larger thing that generates this, and we get to experience it as like fragmented little things, and then perhaps go back to being the larger whole when we pass. Like, I mean, you could frame it any number of ways, but I mean, that's just a model that I find myself playing with most of the time. But with that in mind, if it really is on the deepest level, you're the larger thing experiencing itself subjectively, then your prayers, or meditation, whatever, your silent thoughts, your questions to the universe, if you're really directing it at that larger thing, could potentially be answered. And I would say answered most likely in a kind of synchronicity that is, truth being stranger than fiction, something that has significance. But, I think if you are in that more strict skeptical point of view, those things you can always look at some angle that explains it away as coincidental. So, I mean, I think it does, you really have to ask yourself the question. And I would say not necessarily defer to other people's point of view if they are more skeptical than you. And if you find yourself talking about something like that, feeling like they're kind of, to some extent, trampling on your point of view because they can think of a reason to dismiss it, which I think any of us can think of a reason to dismiss somebody else's experience, because it's the nature of experience to be untransmittable or untransmissible. I mean, we can talk about our experiences, but we really can't convey to other people what we experience. I mean, what we describe just falls so utterly short of all the complexity of emotions and thoughts and assumptions. I mean, just to really take a step back and think about how complex something is and then try to describe it, we don't come close, so we really do exist in a world where we are somewhat, muffled in terms of our ability to express ourselves between, one another. And so my point is, if somebody's really interested in pissing all over your parade because you have a kind of somewhat metaphysical take on what you're experiencing, I wouldn't give them that much credence, because it's something any of us can do. It doesn't take much to be a skeptic, and I'm not necessarily saying skeptics are bad or trying to be negative. Actually, I should say that coming from that point of view myself for a third of my life, roughly, I don't criticize it really on its pragmatic or logical level. I mean, obviously, it makes sense to ascertain what this all is and basically stick to the things that can be proven. I just think that beyond that, if you're willing to sort of take off your materialist hat and put on your, I can't think of a good short phrase for it, but, being more imaginative, allowing yourself to think things that, you can't strictly prove, because sometimes interesting things follow as a consequence of that. I mean, actually, an example that I think is interesting is that, I guess now, because I'm mentioning him, I'll have to put a link, but Thomas Campbell, who is a physicist who's been a consultant for like NASA and I think mainly does simulations, has written at length and spoken at length on YouTube and written books where he's basically saying, just in terms of physics experiments, the correct answers tend to fall out as a logical consequence of assuming that what we experience is a simulation. I can't explain the mechanics of that. I'm not a physicist, but I mean, he does explain those things in a pretty fine-grained explanation. Actually, I find his explanation of the double slit experiment, just in terms of the depth that he goes into, is probably the most thorough that I think you'll find that's still digestible as a layperson. But it, again, I'll put a link to that too. But he does it so many times. There's so many that you can just find. Googling double slit experiment, Thomas Campbell, usually with a slide projector next to him where he's speaking in front of a group of people. There's tons of those that are very effective. Anyway, so sometimes if you can't necessarily explain in a physical, material way why asking a question to yourself might generate a real-life circumstance that answers your question, yeah, I can't explain the mechanics of that, but if you try it and you find that it does seem to happen, and you're willing to entertain the idea, not just dismiss it outright. I mean, I think the biggest thing is just holding your disbelief a bit, to have what could be years of experiences and just file them away. If something kind of interesting or weird happens, I don't know, maybe keep a journal, but just recall it later. And if you can, maybe string through some of those experiences throughout years of your life. Sometimes they're very significant. I'll use one example, which is not strung out over many years, but I mean that I could, but it would take much longer. I mean, just in short, if I didn't go on my first date or join my first band, my son would not have been born. And those events are separated by age 14 and age 29, 15 years. And it's through a sequence of meeting certain people. I mean, you could explain it as just the way people meet people through, groups and networking and things like that. But if to go through it all, there is a kind of stranger than fiction aspect of it. And, you'll have to look at your own life and kind of, as Bruce Lee would say, research your experience. I'm probably paraphrasing, but it's actually helpful to sometimes just think through and report on your own experience to try to analyze it a bit. But anyway, you may find that there are things that are kind of stranger than fiction. But I'll go with a short story, which is just, I had an idea of something I wanted to do a few years ago, and it was, I mean, you could think of it as kind of a project or a business undertaking, but really more of a project. But, and actually, I've been holding this for a while. I'm going to light it. I had this question, do I want to try this thing? it could be essentially risky in the sense that I'd be dedicating a lot of my resources into it, and it could fail in being, supporting at that time a wife and one kid. I had misgivings about it, and so there were risks to it that I just didn't necessarily feel comfortable with. And I actually, at the time, lived in a place with a greenhouse, and I remember pacing back and forth smoking one of these and just thinking, is this a thing I should do? Is it something that might inevitably fail? And I went to bed, still wondering what the answer was. The next morning, the first thing I wake up to, walking into my living room, I'm the last person to go to bed, was basically like a how-to manual I had bought on this very subject of like this project in the middle of my living room floor. And my son wasn't awake yet, and he at the time would have been 6 to 8 months old. He wouldn't really be able to get a book off a shelf. My wife was still asleep. It wasn't there when I went to bed. It was just on the floor in the middle, this very thing that I was thinking of doing. The how-to manual that I owned that was on a bookshelf in another room in a hallway was on the floor. That was really fucking weird. I don't have an explanation for that. A skeptically minded person would just, you could come up with the least generous explanation for me, which is that I'm either lying or that I did it in some way without remembering it, or I'm just mistaken. I have my own experience to rely on. You are going to be the judge of your own experience, and it's going to be up to you to kind of brush aside people who will tell you to, to fuck off, that you're dreaming. Point of fact, I think we are dreaming. But I say that because, it's easy to be skeptical. When I was like 16, 17 years old, I would go on fucking forums and just debate people about shit like that, religious stuff, and I had a real bone to pick with Christianity at that time. I mean, I don't now, but just being a young, like, metalhead atheist that felt a lot of resentment about the kind of oppression that pushed certain people around, and, I wasn't necessarily oppressed. I was a kid from the suburbs. I mean, I wasn't really the target of conservative Christians for the most part, but seeing what they do made a real resentment that I found it coming out as debating people. And the motivation for the debate wasn't like the pursuit of like an intellectual take on, spiritual or existential questions. It was, I just didn't like them and I wanted to fuck with them. And that's not a very, nice or respectable thing to be. And so that's where my head was at like 16, 17, 18 years old. I grew out of it, thankfully. I figured something out, but there's a really good chance if somebody's kind of being that aggressive with your point of view and not being generous with giving you the benefit of the doubt that you might have experience that compels you to think these things. Fuck them. Like, much love. Like, don't hate them. Don't carry around resentment, but just view them as people who have their own take on it, which is fine, and have their own reasons for thinking about it, which are probably going to be a mystery to you, because how well do you know, anybody, even people you know exceedingly well, how well do you really know why they think what they think? So, whether it's looking for synchronicities, prayers to a god, or considering some sort of simulation theory, I mean, taking a shit ton of mushrooms and meaning something you can't explain. It's any number of things, but just, I guess I would say push back against people who are willing to piss all over your dreams. I'm trying to think if I have any other good synchronicities. Well, not a synchronicity, that's not the word for it, but that's specifically coincidences, things that when they happen, draw on some kind of meaning that correlates with something else that, I find that that's not really the example I gave. That would be more like asking a question and getting a really weird, mysterious answer. One other one, again, I know people will probably think I'm fucking weird, but again, this is just my experience. Like, I don't know what to make of it. But that clock up there, I took the batteries out, and just for shits and giggles, because I like double, triple, digits when they come up, I set it to 333. Some number of days later, it's set to 338. It has no fucking battery in it. I didn't drop it or move it, and I don't think anybody else would have walked in and fucked with it. I don't fucking know. In fact, if I were to kind of search myself for an answer, I like the idea that I shifted to a parallel reality. If you want to go the whole parallel reality string theory or fucking whatever. Or the thing actually that made me take the liberty to think that was the Mendel Effect, which I'm fucking endlessly fascinated by. I mean, I don't have an answer, but there are plenty of those things that I remember being a certain way, and I'm just like, what the fuck? How is that not this now anymore? But to anybody who wants to dismiss that as just a misrecollection, I understand. So, people who think that point of view is ridiculous. And I'm not explaining what it is, so that's a bad assumption on my part. Posting a video, I'll link to it, but the idea that we may shift realities, and maybe a lot, maybe multiple times per second, maybe billions of times per second. I mean, I've even considered that maybe that's how fluid motion works, that essentially you might have a system that's like, has pixels, like a computer game, and that shifting, just moving a little bit would be like actually the result of just shifting to the reality where instead of my hand being here, it's right here. And that's actually, it's like all shifting reality. I don't know, that's just kind of a high stone thought that I had. But anyway, the Mendel Effect, the idea that perhaps we have, some number of people have shifted from one reality to another where the history is slightly different, and the origin of that shift would be just speculation. It's utterly mysterious if it is true, but it's just large number of people who remember Berenstain Bears versus Berenstein Bears, or remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 90s versus getting out of prison and then dying in like 2011 or 2013. I mean, I didn't dedicate that one to memory. That's not really an important one to me. The Berenstain Bears that really fucks with me. And then there's lots of others, but I'm not going to exhaust a whole list. But anyway, just, getting back to my original point, giving yourself permission to think things like that, because reality is a lot more interesting when you'll at least consider those possibilities, and not just clam up because somebody who's smart and can put together a good argument. And I consider myself smart, so I'm not saying that that's exclusively smart people. I'm just saying people who they have the capacity to put together good arguments and are inclined to shoot down fanciful ideas because it kind of upsets some sensibility they have, I think is probably my best take on it. Don't get too bogged down by those people, and don't let them close doors of imagination that might be interesting to you. I mean, even if it isn't correct, who knows, maybe you write an interesting story based on some of those explorations, or, just open your mind and then to something that maybe a decade later pays off. I don't know. I mean, I read the Bhagavad Gita in high school. I had no fucking idea what it meant, and yet hearing people talk about it a decade later and having the frame of reference to know what it was, like it kind of locked things in, or, knocked things loose, or had a kind of lock and key relationship, however you want to say it. But, I found that those little threads sometimes reconnect decades later. So I guess with that thought, I'll wrap this up. Much love to all the skeptics, materialists. We all have a point of view. We all make this place beautiful. No disrespect intended. Sometimes you can be a little bit shrill, but we all can. So, enjoy your now.